Of course, you can make anything stand up and produce solutions, but you have to become understanding of the position of Bjarke one day, Zaha another day, Foster another day, and you have to be able to articulate your position to a point where you have to know when to stop. If you don't have that resilience to want to change the world someday, you can't do it overnight, then it's the wrong path. I think there's always a risk if you think of your work as a popularity context. There is a kind of a poverty of mind and a vacuity in your head that comes from thinking that way. Your ego takes over, and the poverty grows in your brain.
Subscribe to BlessedArch for your dose of art, architecture and design, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Hey guys, welcome back to BlessedArch. Welcome back to another video. Today is a very special video. Today we have with us Professor Hanif Kara. But before we get to him, let me tell you a little bit about him. Meet Hanif Kara. He's a practicing structural engineer and professor in practice of architectural technology at the Graduate School of Design, Harvard. He's also the design director and co-founder of AKT II. The practice has won over 350 design awards, including the RIBA Stirling Award for Peckham Library in 2000, for the Sainsbury Laboratory in 2012, and for the Bloomberg European headquarters in 2018, as well as the RIBA Lubetkin Prize for the UK Pavilion at Shanghai Expo in 2010. The practice was also awarded by Building Magazine as Engineering Consultant of the Year 2019. Today we will explore how Hanif started his practice and try and understand its workings. It's so good to connect with you. I have listened to your talks for a while now and I wanted to connect, and it's an amazing opportunity today that I get to connect with you today.
Rishabh, thank you for inviting me. I've also watched some of your rise to stardom, so I like this. I think it's nice to have the opportunity to talk to your generation.
Thank you so much. And I think there's a lot that people can get learning from your conversation, especially usually as architects we don't really hear from engineers that much, and especially when I hear your talks, you genuinely talk about design and not just the structural part of it, how architects are inspired. You get that inspiration and your work is sort of bringing that inspiration and giving that legs, and I think that is something that what I really got from your talks, your work, and that is something that I really wanted to explore today.
Thank you. No, I started the whole practice 25 years ago after being a normal engineer. When I started the office with my colleagues, the whole idea was to be in this intersection of design and technology, which is shared by architects and engineers. So yeah, that's what my whole business has been built on, my practice, my studio, and the work. So I'm happy to share it now.
That is just amazing. So I have a few questions for you today. Some question that I think my audience would love to know from you. So I'll jump right in and let's go through them. Now, before we start the interview, I just wanted to let you know that BlessedArch is on Patreon. Once you become a patron, you not only get access to bonus videos like the extended conversation from this video as well, but you will help support BlessedArch and make the community bigger and more connected with people all over the world. So do consider supporting. The link is in the description below. Now, let's start our conversation. I want to understand your journey since after graduation. The time was very different. The way to do things, especially in the field, was very different. So I want to know your journey, what experiences you gained, and till the point when you finally opened your own firm.
Okay, no, that's a good question. So I had an unusual graduation. So in the sense that I worked as a draftsman and steel welder before I went to university. So I had some experience of steelwork. So I graduated in civil engineering in 83, 84. And the first 3 or 4 years I spent on what I call hardcore engineering, oil rigs, roller coasters, nuclear power stations. So I worked a lot on those kind of things for the first, I would say, 10 years, Then I jumped from the north. I lived in the north at that time. I lived in Scotland and Manchester, and then came to London, where I got interested in architecture. So I worked for other people for a few years and enjoyed it, but it was always with no control or no ability to push my discipline. It was always, I was always forced to solve problems, and I didn't want to just do that. Hence, I found colleagues who had the same knowledge, and we started our office 25 years ago. So I think we were pretty established as engineers, and we had worked with a lot of contractors on how to make things. So one of our clever things was that architects who were struggling to realize their dream, we could actually help without them having to go to the constructor. The other part of the journey was, all of that time I realized that my education as an engineer was not good, in the sense that I wasn't taught to communicate about aesthetics or linguistics or culture. It was just pure physics and maths. So I wanted to enter that education world at the same time. So I started teaching at the same moment at the Architectural Association. So that's the beginning of the practice. I've only done an undergraduate in civil engineering. I never studied architecture.
Now, one thing that was, since you have an Indian heritage as well, whether you were sort of pushed into engineering, or did you like decide on it yourself?
No, I think that I'll be honest, I decided myself. I mean, most parents want us to be doctors, as you know, and go into science in a big way. My father didn't. He was on the construction sites in East Africa, Uganda, where we lived, where I was born. So when I came to this country, I was influenced by the ability of construction to improve people's lives already, and I took up civil engineering for that. I wasn't pushed, you know, but my father did want me to go to university, and I chose not to immediately. I started to work first, then I went to university afterwards. So I wasn't pushed. I wasn't so unlucky, you know. In some students I see that they're pushed into it, and then I grew the passion, I think.
All right. So now I want to talk a bit about your practice. You have worked with some of the biggest names in the industry, from Zaha Hadid to Bjarke Ingels. So first, let's talk about the experience of that. Like, what has been collaborating with these firms like?
You know, it's quite exciting, mesmerizing. Every day is different, because they are all different people, even though we call them architects. They all start from a different place in architecture. You know, some of them are interested in form, some are interested in changing the world, others are interested in sustainability. So as an engineer, it has really been exciting, because you learn from them as much as you tell them what you think they need to do. And that excitement has meant that you grow a relationship. And it's taken many years, but if you look at the portfolio of the practice, whether we're working with the best architects or clients, there's a repetition of client type and architect type. We don't select building types or project type. You know, we select architects and clients and geography. Where do we want to work? And we find that most of these people that you mentioned, you know, and I have to be very cautious not to be choosing between them. You know, I can respond to all of them, and this is the crux of what I describe as design. Because if you're a design as in an engineer, of course you can make anything stand up and produce solutions, but you have to become understanding of the position of Bjarke one day, Zaha another day, Foster another day, and you have to be able to articulate your position to a point where you have to know when to stop telling them, because they have a particular view, and every one of them is different. So there's no moment every time where I can stop. You know, I have to reorientate, and the whole practice is built on that culture of having this excitement. And I have to be very honest, you know, it's the success of all of these people that carries you to be successful in our case. And it demands a certain kind of risk-taking and respect. So we have respect for all of these people. They respect what we do. Sometimes it's quite difficult, but we get through it, and so far it's an incredible journey, and they're all nicer people than what the press tell you. They're all just human beings, and going out to dinner with them or meeting them for culture or whatever is incredibly exhilarating. So that's why I said to you earlier, this becomes a way of life. They're also, many of them are also in my social circle, my academic circle. We have similar interests in what we would like to achieve and so on. So it is about building a relationship to their way of working and thinking, and sometimes reorientating it a bit. You can have an influence on changing their mind. So I find it exciting. I find it really amazing, and I've been very lucky to meet so many. I think that's partly to do with being in London. It helps because London is kind of the center of a lot of design contours. People come in and out and through all the time. So there is a respect built for your stability in London. So in a sense, I think that has been a contributing factor, because I work with international architects, but I've always been based in London and Boston when I'm teaching.
So speaking of, also when you said, influencing them as well, this is one thing that I wanted to discuss. I saw on your works, there were a lot of competition entries that your firm worked at. First of all, I want to know what stage are you brought in? Do you work with them from the get-go, working of how, something can come to life as well? Or is the whole idea sort of presented to you and shown like, now we need to bring this to life? At what stage do you come in?
You were asking if I get involved in the get-go. The answer is yes, because most international competitions require the architect to invent, and he needs his partners with him. So in that situation, this is what I talk about when I say we're in the design field as well. We're not just to solve problems. We're helping them invent, come with new ideas, new forms, new materiality. How do you use different materials and so on to win the competition. And often that is the starting point. And over the years, more and more, we are selected by many of the best architects to join their team early. When we first started, we used to work for contractors quite a lot to understand and push the whole idea of how you make and build, also to run the business. We had to earn money to survive. But as we've gone more and more successful with many of these people, we do more and more international competitions, and we're more and more taken in by the architects to support them. And sometimes the clients will say, I want to work with that architect, but you will be the engineer. So sometimes we're three teams, in a competition, because the client selected us because he feels we can talk the language of the architect. He can't, and he would like us to get the best out of the architect. So we have had occasions like that. It's an investment on their part, it's an investment on our part, and you don't always win, but you also sometimes, after winning, they can actually not secure you a position. The client might say, no, I have my own engineer. Then what happens is that's where the relationship comes in, because they know that you helped them or worked with them, and then the next time they will bring you in on another project or something. So it's a long-term game. And we've built enough reputation and integrity with many of these architects to a point where they trust us to not share, with all of the other architects. But also they built us into a situation where they know we're also contributing to the co-creative process, rather than just there to solve. I also feel that many architects need the confidence. The best architects are good engineers as well. And the best engineers are pretty good architects. That's what happens in this scenario. So when we go and talk together, the client is usually quite convinced that this team can build it. They know what they're talking about, cost or construction. And that's part of the game, strategic game in aiming for competitions and aiming high all the time. But to do that, you have to get-go, you have to do it from the beginning. You can't just come in after the solutions are done. We have done that, but it's not always as much fun.
All right. So whenever you are faced with iconic designs, so to say, what is your approach like? Do you sort of feel like, here we go again, another one? Or, are you like, okay, new challenge?
Yeah, no. I think we have never been kind of worried about here we go again. We've had to invent on almost every one of our buildings you see. So what we've done is, sometimes we have known how we might make it work, and we will say, give us some time and we will make it work. But sometimes we know exactly how to make it work, but most of the time we can make it work. We know that. Even the most incredible projects, like say Zaha Hadid's Azerbaijan Cultural Center, or Fino Science Center, or Norman Foster's Bloomberg headquarters building, which was built in a very complex site where the London origin is, with lots of tunnels and so on. So in all of these complexities, or even with David Chipperfield, where we built on the beach with the Turner Museum, what happens is we don't know the answer, but we find ourselves in that situation. Great, this is a new challenge. We're going to learn something more, which we can apply to other projects. And we're also going to help the world see a new way of thinking. And this is where some of our tools are fantastic. So one of the things we've always done as a practice is reinvent and build the tools computationally quite a lot in order to do some of this work. And I think that's been the essence of our success in the first 10 years. Was it hit the moment when parametrics and digital was taking off. So we had to make everyone convinced. First you can draw it, then you can visualize it, then you can also make it. And engineers were very good at that compared to architects, because we were computational. Then post that period, which is the last 10 or 15 years, other things, we're post-digital now. So we find ourselves always that making sense of what it is they want to do. And sometimes when it's not going to work, we will tell them, this is never going to work. And by the way, this is what you could do to make it work if you want. And it's very rare, but most of the time they listen. They listen. But we push the boundaries. And it's good for our industry, because as I said to you earlier, one of the wonderful things of being in the position my practice is in is we're trying to also change our own discipline, the engineering discipline. Like you said, you don't often talk to engineers. We're trying to encourage engineers to actually change the way we think and work if they want to survive in the future. So trying to redraw all the time, what is the future engineer going to look like? What is the future architect going to look like? And say, okay, the practice should keep going towards that. And we select partners that push us towards that direction.
That's actually brilliant. All right. So, do discussions with architects ever get heated?
All the time. I mean, even yesterday I had one. I mean, you can be very close friends, but there will be moments where you will both feel you're not listening to each other, and you end up arguing about something or the other. And then you have to cool off, and it comes back to a sensible solution, because once both parties realize we're in the same game and we want the same goal, it happens. And I think this is, in answer to your questions, there's two ways of thinking about it. The ones we work with and the ones we haven't worked with. So I have had heated arguments with the ones I've never worked with, because I take a very strong position on design, and some of them think I shouldn't, because I'm only an engineer, right? And this is sometimes a heated debate about where is it their position, what is our position. I never become an architect. I would never speak like an architect in detail, and the education is different. But we have heated arguments at university, for example, on those issues. What is the role of design? What is the role of engineer and architect in design? In our projects, we fall out with architects all the time, because we don't look for popularity. We look for getting the final solution right. And at the end, we're always popular, even if we didn't speak to each other for a year. We made it work. And then they will come back, and we win the awards, and we're all happier, It's the way we think. I think there's always a risk if you think of your work as a popularity context. There is a kind of a poverty of mind and a vacuity in your head that comes from thinking that way. Your ego takes over, and the poverty grows in your brain, in a sense. So what you got to do really is say, no, there's a bigger game here. let's not fall out. Let's find a better solution.
True. And I think those arguments also a lot of times just stem from passion itself. It's like
Totally.
because you're so passionate, and there can be then debates that start off on different things because of that.
No, I'm impressed that you know, because you're so young, right? Most architects take 20 years to discover that. The engineer is not against you, and that the passion is coming from wanting to make it work, having empathy. You're feeling his pain or her pain, and you want it to work for them. It takes a certain level of maturity from the architects to also appreciate that.
Is there one project where you feel like a project that you've been a part of that you really loved, like how it came out at the end of the day, like you really loved how the project was, just something that inspired you?
Listen, Isab, I'm not kidding you. There isn't, because I like different things about different projects. Because if you look at the portfolio, you'll see we've been lucky to win the Stirling Prize 3 times, right? And the Stirling Prize is the highest level, and it's the architect who's the author. Each of those buildings is different. One is a laboratory, one is an office building, and the first one was a library. But if you look at the Peckham Library project with Bill Alsop, people said it was unbelievable. You couldn't make it stand. You can't make it. You can't do this. It's the wrong color, all sorts of things. But I liked many things about it. And some of those things transfer to other projects, even though the architects would never admit that they share certain tastes. I can see it, that there is a certain commonality amongst the best architects. They're all trying to improve the quality of life as well as have a career, whatever it was, lab, laboratory, office. So I don't specifically have one. I never had one. Technically challenging, I would say, was definitely the Pheno Science Center early in my career, because when we drew that and when we won the competition, we knew it was impossible to analyze, impossible to make it stand, impossible to find the concrete you could make. We knew that, but we didn't know whether we would be fired or prisoned or whatever, But eventually, technically, in Germany, it's very tough. We made it happen. Right now, we have a fantastic museum on site with Foster and Partners, the Sheikh Zayed National Museum in Abu Dhabi. It was another one of these where we didn't know if it would ever get built. It took 9 or 10 years, and now it's rising out of the ground. But the complexity of the structure, and to simplify that into something buildable in the desert in some ways, was challenging. So it's not a favorite. None of these are favorite. They're all my favorites. It's like your children in a way.
Okay, so what would be your advice for any young architects out there?
Young architects would be that you must take the profession seriously. In my opinion, architecture is as important as agriculture, because the things we leave behind are buildings in the end, and the past and the near future of the world is driven by how we live and how we create togetherness. So I have learned a lot about architecture through being around architects. I spent a lot of time with the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, where I was on the steering committee, and I was fortunate enough to see until the different types of architects all over the world, and everywhere one common thing was they were passionate and they wanted to change the world. So to any young architect, I would say, if you don't have that resilience to want to change the world someday, you can't do it overnight, then it's the wrong path. It's the wrong path for you, because that's what you should be aiming for. And you shouldn't be ending up in thinking about the career. You shouldn't be ending up in getting stuck in the conversation about designing, what is the new way of designing. Think about designing a new world, and how will you get to the new world, and what will your role be as an architect? Will you be called an architect at that point? Once you do that, I think you can make a clear decision about what you want to do in the future. And don't be overawed by star culture. Star culture is a dying thing. It will never finish, but it is rare. for people to make big news. And with the way the world is going, it's not necessary anymore. You can all change the world in many different ways. So my own instinct is that you should stick with architecture, because I find a lot of architects, they get to the end of it's a long education, and then they go into banking like engineers or whatever, and my opinion is you don't do that. You should make it a way of life. And collaborate, reach out to people like me, anybody who wants to mentor, guide, help. You'll find that most people in the world will help, because they all see it as an important thing. Many people helped me to get here.
All right. So one final question that I wanted to ask you is any advice you would have for somebody who's sort of deciding between engineering and architecture? This goes back, after school when you're sort of deciding. So any advice for people?
No, my advice is that don't do both, because there are people who claim that you can do both, right? And they're called architect or engitect, I call them. You can't, because the part of your brain that works, if you want to get it sharp, right? Say you want to be an engineer, you have to be deeply immersed in that career in order to understand what architecture is. You've got to become really good at it. Equally, I think architecture, which is a broader humanities and arts field, probably taxes other side of your brain more than the technology, say. Therefore, I think it demands a different kind of process from you. So if you're going to go in that path, be clear that you will have to learn to collaborate with engineers. Be clear that, there's science and technology behind you. But don't rely on technology, because as an architect, you will be expected to think about humanity, philosophy, linguistics, all those other social contexts. So I do feel that you need to be clear about what you want to do. So my advice is you study one of them and become really good at that till you're one of the top. And then you can always learn the other as you're going along. You can learn more about them. You don't have to be the other. So that would be my advice. If you're making a choice between the two, my instinct is architects make a lot more money. But, they don't care as much perhaps about money. So there's a conflict and a paradoxical thing. And that is also driven by the desire to be stars in part. And that's changing. So going forward, it's still a very important career in architecture. My advice again is that you start to understand the current problems like climate change, inequity in technology. Some parts of the world still don't have light and other parts are using Zoom. Understand that is an architect needs to understand all that, because they can unite these things. Engineers equally. So you make a choice based on how much you want to do and where you want to be with it. Personally, I like maths and physics, so I was happy with just doing that. All jobs should be careers, and they eventually become a way of life. You can't just qualify and leave. You can't qualify and say, I've done my job now, next 30 years I'll do something else, or just attend the office. It becomes a way of life, and it's connected directly to your world and what interests you. And then they stopped, because it was a paradox, zero carbon in the desert. But the model changed, but the research that was done to get to that first model, where the temperature is now reduced because of just the way the buildings are designed, passive, it's incredibly good research. When that conversation happened, and she says that you were the guy that helped her, because you made the first building, the very complex building, Science Center, stand up when everybody said it wouldn't stand up. I said to them, the problem with Zaha was she was 20 years ahead of all of us, mathematically, linguistically, formally, and even in a knowledge of everything.
And thank you so much for taking out the time today. It was a brilliant conversation. I learned a lot, so I'm sure people would have learned a lot from it.
I'm so glad you invited me, honestly, because you might not know it. Like I said to you, in any conversation, every conversation one has, you learn something, both of you, and you also you can't practice these answers. You know, it happens live, and I think this means of communication is very important because it brings out of you what you really feel and think about stuff. And so I think you must stick with this. Recruit more people, more staff, and then make sure you keep it international as well. Yeah.
That's the goal, to go bigger and get more people. Yeah. Thank you so much, Hanif. Thank
Okay,
you so
thank
much.
you.